Between 1845 and 1852, a blight that devastated Ireland's potato crop, the single staple food that a large share of the rural Irish population depended on almost entirely for survival, triggered one of the most catastrophic demographic events in modern European history. Ireland's population fell by roughly a quarter within less than a decade, through a combination of starvation, disease, and one of the largest sustained waves of emigration the Atlantic world has ever seen. Somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million people died directly as a result of the famine, and a further 1 to 2 million fled the country entirely, most of them crossing the Atlantic to the United States and Canada, with smaller but still substantial numbers reaching England, Scotland, and Australia. This migration reshaped the demographic character of entire American and Canadian cities within a single generation. Boston, New York, and Philadelphia absorbed Irish famine immigrants in numbers so large that by the 1850s, Irish-born residents made up a significant share of the total population in several major East Coast port cities, and the social, political, and religious infrastructure of Irish Catholic America, the parish networks, the political machines, the labor union structures, were substantially built by exactly this generation of famine refugees and their immediate children. The scale and speed of this migration bears emphasizing, because it is easy, from a distance of a century and a half, to lose sight of just how compressed and chaotic the actual crossing experience was for the people living through it. In the pre-famine years, Irish immigration to North America had been a steady but comparatively modest trickle, driven mostly by economic opportunity rather than survival. The blight transformed this trickle into a flood almost overnight. Within a single year of the first serious crop failure in 1845, emigration numbers had already begun climbing sharply, and by the famine's worst years, 1847 through 1849, hundreds of thousands of Irish men, women, and children were crossing the Atlantic annually, often with only the barest resources to fund the crossing, and frequently traveling on vessels that were poorly equipped, dangerously overcrowded, and effectively unregulated for passenger safety. Mortality aboard these so-called coffin ships was severe enough that some crossings recorded passenger death rates comparable to those of slave ships of the same era, a grim historical comparison that contemporary observers themselves drew at the time. This is the context in which the following surnames need to be understood, not simply as names that happen to be common among Irish-American families today, but as the specific family names that survive in documented form, connected to a 7-year window of crisis so severe that it permanently altered the demographic trajectory of an entire nation and gave rise to one of the largest single forced migrations in the history of the Atlantic world. What is less widely understood, even among people who know their own family arrived sometime around the famine, is how specific and how traceable this migration actually was. Famine-era immigration was not evenly distributed across all Irish surnames and all Irish counties. Certain counties were hit far harder by the blight and by subsequent eviction than others. Certain surnames were concentrated overwhelmingly in exactly these hardest hit counties and ship manifests. Parish records and American and Canadian immigration records from this specific 7-year window have survived in far greater quantity and detail than most people realize, making it genuinely possible, in many cases, to trace a specific family surname back to a specific county, a specific parish, and sometimes even a specific ship that carried a famine-era ancestor across the Atlantic. Genealogists and historians who specialize in this period have spent decades cross-referencing Irish parish registers, pre-famine tithe records, famine-era relief and eviction records, and the passenger manifests of the ships that carried Irish emigrants to North America. And out of this research, a clear picture has emerged of which surnames appear with the greatest frequency and the clearest documented concentration in the famine emigration itself. Below are 17 of the surnames most consistently and most heavily documented as having crossed the Atlantic during this specific and devastating 7-year window. Kelly is, by a wide margin, one of the most common surnames in all of Ireland, and famine-era immigration records reflect that overall national density rather than any single narrow regional concentration. The surname derives from the Irish O Tialai, and it appears across ship manifests arriving in Boston, New York, and Quebec throughout the entire famine period in numbers large enough that genealogists researching a Kelly ancestor from this era typically need very specific corroborating detail, a county of origin, a parish baptismal record, a known ship name. Before a particular famine era, Kelly can be confidently connected to a specific family line, simply because the surname was so widespread across so many unrelated Irish families even before the famine began. This sheer ubiquity is itself worth understanding because it explains a pattern that shows up repeatedly throughout famine-era genealogical research. The most common Irish surnames are often, paradoxically, the hardest to trace with precision, not because The documentary record is thin, but because it is too dense, containing so many unrelated Kelly families from so many different counties that establishing which specific Kelly line a modern family descends from requires ruling out dozens of plausible alternative candidates before arriving at confidence. Researchers tracing a Kelly line typically begin by narrowing the search geographically using whatever fragmentary family tradition survives. A remembered county name, a remembered parish, even a vague sense of which part of Ireland the family came from, before attempting to match that narrow geographic window against the specific parish and shipping records for Kelly families from that particular area. O'Sullivan, frequently anglicized simply to Sullivan upon arrival in North America, was heavily concentrated in Munster, particularly in County Cork and County Kerry, both of which were among the counties hit hardest by the famine's mortality and eviction crisis. Cork's port city, Cove, known during this period as Queenstown, served as one of the single busiest points of famine-era emigration departure in the entire country. And Sullivan families from the surrounding Cork and Kerry countryside appear with heavy concentration in the passenger lists of ships departing from exactly that port throughout the famine years. The Cork and Kerry region's particular vulnerability to the famine stemmed from a combination of factors that historians of the period have documented in considerable detail: an unusually high dependence on subdivided smallholdings, too small to support any crop diversification beyond the potato, a landlord class in the region that responded to the crisis with some of the country's highest recorded eviction rates once rent arrears, became unmanageable, and a rugged coastal geography that had historically supported dense rural settlement precisely because potato cultivation, unlike grain farming, could be productively carried out on marginal land unsuited to other crops. When that single crop failed repeatedly across successive growing seasons, the same geographic and economic factors that had allowed dense settlement in the first place left the population with no viable alternative food source, which is part of why Cork and Kerry recorded some of the highest combined mortality and emigration rates of any counties in Ireland. Walsh, an Anglicization reflecting Norman Welsh settlement in Ireland centuries before the famine, was heavily represented in counties Mayo, Galway, and Wexford, three counties that experienced some of the most severe famine mortality and subsequent mass eviction in the entire country. Mayo, in Daears, particular became a byword for famine devastation, and Walsh families appear repeatedly in the workhouse admission records, relief lists, and eviction notices that survive from Mayo's famine-era archives, many of these same families subsequently appearing on emigrant ship manifests within a year or two of the relief and eviction records that first documented their crisis. Mayo's catastrophic famine experience is worth understanding in some detail, since it illustrates why certain counties produced such disproportionately heavy emigration relative to their overall population. Contemporary observers, including government relief officials sent to assess conditions in the county, described scenes of destitution in Mayo so severe that some of their written reports remain among the most harrowing. Primary source documents to survive from the entire famine period. The combination of an overwhelmingly potato-dependent tenant population, a landlord class largely absent from direct estate management, and administrative relief efforts that proved consistently inadequate to the actual scale of need meant that Mayo families who survived the famine's worst years often did so only by abandoning tenancies entirely, a pattern that produced both a famine-era emigration wave and a documented post-famine wave of continued departure as surviving family members followed relatives who had already established themselves in North America. Murphy, deriving from the Irish O Murchada, is heavily concentrated historically in County Wexford and the broader southeastern region of Ireland, an area that, while somewhat less catastrophically affected than the western counties, still produced substantial famine-era emigration as tenant farming families lost the ability to pay rent following successive years of potato crop failure. Murphy families appear consistently across ship manifests. Arriving at Grosse Isle, the Canadian quarantine station on the St. Lawrence River that processed the overwhelming majority of famine-era Irish emigrants bound for Canada, and the surviving Grosse Isle records remain one of the richest documentary sources available for tracing this specific surname's famine emigration. Murphy's status as Ireland's single most common surname today, a position it has held for well over a century, means that Wexford origin functions as a particularly important piece of narrowing evidence for anyone attempting famine-era research on this specific name, since the surname's sheer national ubiquity would otherwise make individual family tracing all but impossible without some additional geographic anchor point to work from. O'Brien traces to one of medieval Ireland's most prominent ruling dynasties, the descendants of the historical High King Brian Boru, and by the famine era, the surname had spread widely across Munster, with particularly heavy concentration in County Clare. Clare's famine mortality and eviction rates were among the highest recorded in the country. and O'Brien families from Clare appear with notable frequency in the surviving records of the Encumbered Estates Court, a legal mechanism established in the famine's aftermath specifically to allow heavily indebted Irish landlords to sell off estates, a process that triggered a further significant wave of tenant eviction and emigration in the years immediately following the famine's worst mortality. Ryan, from the Irish O Mau Ilriain, was concentrated historically in County Tipperary and the surrounding Midland counties, a region whose agricultural economy was significantly disrupted by the famine, even though its mortality rates, while severe, were somewhat lower than in the worst affected western counties. Tipperary Ryan families emigrated in substantial numbers throughout the famine period, and the surname appears with particular frequency in the surviving records of Irish immigrant aid societies established in Boston and New York, specifically to assist new arrivals from this region in finding housing and employment. Kennedy from the Irish O Sinead was historically concentrated in counties Tipperary and Clare, and its most famous famine-era emigration story is also one of the best documented, the family of Patrick Kennedy, great-grandfather of President John F. Kennedy, emigrated from New Ross in County Wexford to Boston in 1849 in the midst of the famine's worst years, a documented emigration that has made the Kennedy family's specific famine crossing one of the most extensively researched individual famine emigration stories in existence, and one that genealogists studying this period frequently cite as a well-documented case study of the broader pattern. Doyle, an anglicization of the Irish O Dubagail, was concentrated historically in County Wexford and the surrounding southeastern counties, an area that produced a substantial and well-documented famine-era emigration stream, particularly through the port of New Ross, which served as a major departure point for emigrants from this specific region throughout the famine years, and whose surviving shipping records document Doyle families departing with notable frequency between 1846 and 1851. McCarthy, from the Irish Mac Carthay, descends from one of medieval Munster's most powerful ruling families and remained heavily concentrated in County Cork by the famine era. Cork's severe famine mortality, combined with its status as home to Cove, one of the country's busiest emigration ports, produced a particularly heavy and well-documented McCarthy emigration stream, with the surname appearing consistently. Across surviving Cork workhouse records, relief lists, and outbound ship manifests throughout the entire famine period, Connolly, from the Irish O Conghale, was historically concentrated in counties Monaghan, Meath, and Galway, with the Galway branch of the surname particularly affected by the severe famine mortality and eviction crisis that devastated much of Connacht. Connolly families from Galway appear with notable frequency in the surviving records of assisted emigration schemes, a specific category of famine-era emigration in which some landlords, rather than simply evicting destitute tenants, paid directly for their passage to North America as a way of permanently clearing their estates of tenant populations they could no longer profitably support. O'Reilly, frequently shortened to Riley upon arrival in North America, was historically concentrated in County Cavan and the surrounding border counties of Ulster's southern edge, a region that experienced significant famine-era hardship, even though its mortality rates were somewhat lower than in the worst affected western counties. Riley families from Cavan appear consistently in the surviving records of emigrant remittance networks, through which established Irish emigrants in North America sent money back to Ireland specifically to fund the passage of additional family members, a documented financial pattern that allowed entire extended Riley family networks to relocate across the Atlantic in a staggered sequence over several famine-era years rather than in a single crossing. Gallagher, from the Irish O Galshobhair, was concentrated overwhelmingly in County Donegal, one of Ulster's most severely famine-affected counties, where remote and mountainous terrain had already left much of the tenant population dependent on potato cultivation to a degree that made the blight's impact especially catastrophic. Donegal Gallagher families appear heavily in the surviving records of emigration through the port of Derry, which served as Ulster's primary famine-era departure point, and whose surviving shipping records document a sustained and heavy Gallagher emigration stream throughout the famine's worst years. Nolan, from the Irish O Nualain, was historically concentrated in County Carlow and the surrounding southeastern Midlands, a region whose famine-era experience, while less catastrophic in raw mortality terms than the western counties, still produced substantial tenant displacement as landlords increasingly turned to large-scale eviction in the famine's later years, once it became clear that successive harvest failures had left many tenant families permanently unable to pay rent. Nolan families from Carlow appear with notable frequency in the encumbered estates court records described earlier, reflecting the broader pattern of post-famine landlord-driven eviction that continued to drive Irish emigration even after the worst of the blight itself had passed. Byrne, from the Irish O'Broin, was historically concentrated in County Wicklow and the surrounding southeastern region, And while Wicklow's famine mortality was somewhat lower than in Ireland's most severely affected western counties, the county's proximity to Dublin meant that Byrne emigrants frequently departed through Dublin's port rather than through the smaller regional ports used more heavily by families from the west and southwest, producing a distinct and separately documented emigration pattern that genealogists researching this specific surname need to account for when searching shipping records. Flynn, from the Irish O Floyne, appears with particular historical concentration in County Roscommon and the surrounding Midland counties, a region that experienced severe famine-era hardship as its heavily potato-dependent tenant farming economy collapsed under successive years of blight. Roscommon Flynn families appear consistently in the surviving records of Workhouse Admission, a grim but genealogically valuable documentary. Source, since Workhouse Admission registers from this period frequently recorded not just a family's name, but their townland of origin, occupation, and family composition in considerable detail, information that later proved essential in helping many families reconstruct their exact pre-emigration circumstances. Brennan, from the Irish O Brownian, was historically concentrated across several Midland and southeastern counties, including Kilkenny and Roscommon, and the surname's relatively broad geographic distribution across Ireland by the Famine-era means that Brennan emigration records are correspondingly scattered across a wider range of departure ports and destination cities than some of the more regionally concentrated surnames on this list. Genealogists researching Brennan famine emigration typically find it necessary to establish a specific county of origin through parish or tithe records before attempting to trace a specific family's emigration path with confidence. Fitzgerald, the Anglo-Norman surname discussed at length in relation to Norman conquest history, had, by the Famine-era, become deeply rooted in counties Kerry and Limerick specifically, following the medieval Fitzgerald dynasty's centuries-long establishment as one of Munster's most powerful landholding families. Despite this aristocratic medieval origin, by the 19th century, the great majority of Fitzgerald families in Kerry and Limerick were themselves tenant farmers rather than landholders, having been absorbed over the centuries into the same tenant farming economy as the rest of the rural Irish population, and Kerry and Limerick Fitzgerald families accordingly appear heavily in famine-era emigration records, departing through Cork and other southwestern Irish ports throughout the entire 7-year crisis. The reason famine-era emigration is so much more traceable today than many people assume is a direct consequence of how the crisis itself was documented, both by the British administration attempting to manage it and by the immigration industry that grew rapidly around it. Workhouse admission registers, established under the Irish poor law system, recorded destitute families in considerable demographic detail as a matter of routine administrative practice. The Encumbered Estates Court, established specifically to handle the wave of landlord bankruptcies triggered by the famine, generated extensive property and tenant records as it processed estate sales throughout the 1850s. And the shipping industry that carried well over 1 million Irish emigrants across the Atlantic during this single decade was required, under both British and American law, to maintain passenger manifests recording, at minimum, each passenger's name, age, and general origin, producing an enormous surviving documentary base that later genealogists have painstakingly transcribed, indexed, and in many cases digitized. Grosse Isle, the Canadian quarantine station that processed the majority of famine-era emigrants bound for Canada, has become one of the single richest documentary sources for this research, specifically because so many emigrants who died during or shortly after the Atlantic crossing were recorded there in unusually complete detail, as quarantine officials attempted to track disease outbreaks aboard the notoriously overcrowded and unsanitary emigrant ships that came to be known grimly but accurately as coffin ships. The scale of mortality recorded at Grosse Isle alone, several thousand Irish emigrants are buried in mass graves on the island, having survived the Atlantic crossing only to die of typhus or dysentery in the quarantine station itself, stands as one of the starkest single pieces of physical evidence of just how catastrophic the famine emigration experience actually was for the people who lived through it. The scale of documentation surviving from Grosse Isle in particular has made it possible for later researchers to reconstruct not just names and dates, but in many cases the specific townland of origin for individual emigrant families, since quarantine officials recording deaths and admissions frequently asked surviving family members to identify precisely where in Ireland they had come from. Information that was recorded partly for administrative purposes and partly, in the case of fatal cases, so that surviving relatives could eventually be notified through parish networks back in Ireland. This level of documentary specificity is considerably rarer for emigrants who survived the crossing without incident and simply disembarked to begin their new lives, which is part of why genealogists researching famine-era ancestry often find that the clearest and most detailed documentary trail exists, somewhat counterintuitively, for families whose famine-era crossing involved tragedy rather than a straightforward arrival. For families researching their own possible connection to this migration, the recommended starting point is establishing, as precisely as possible, a specific Irish county or parish of origin, since Irish surnames, like the English and French surnames discussed in earlier research on this subject, tend to cluster regionally in ways that make county-level identification the single most useful piece of information available before attempting to search shipping manifests or workhouse records directly. Civil registration of births, marriages, and deaths did not begin in Ireland until 1864, well after the famine had ended, which means that pre-famine and famine-era Irish genealogical research depends almost entirely on Catholic parish baptismal and marriage registers, many of which have survived and been microfilmed by the National Library of Ireland, alongside the pre-famine tithe allotment records and Griffith's Valuation Property Survey, both of which document the tenant population, in the years immediately before and after the famine's worst years, and remain among the most heavily used starting points for Irish family history research today. Beyond these core Irish sources, researchers working from the North American side of the crossing have an increasingly rich set of digitized resources available as well. The Boston Pilot, a Catholic newspaper published throughout the famine period and for decades afterward, ran a long-running column called Missing Friends, in which recently arrived Irish immigrants placed advertisements seeking information about family members from whom they had become separated during or after the crossing. And these advertisements, many of which have since been compiled into a searchable database, frequently include precise details about county of origin, parish, and even the specific ship and year of crossing, making this newspaper archive one of the most valuable and unexpectedly personal documentary sources available to modern researchers tracing a specific famine-era family line. Confirming a direct family connection to the famine emigration is not a matter of idle historical curiosity. It connects a modern family, often without prior awareness of just how close and how documented that connection actually is, to one of the defining catastrophes of 19th century Europe, an event that permanently altered Ireland's population, reshaped the demographic character of entire North American cities, and left behind a documentary trail in workhouse registers, encumbered estate records, and quarantine station logs that is considerably richer and more specific than most descendants realize until they begin looking. It is also worth remembering, in a way that is easy to lose sight of amid the genealogical mechanics of surnames and shipping manifests, exactly what kind of decision famine-era emigration actually represented for the families who made it. Leaving Ireland during these years was rarely a matter of seeking opportunity in the way later. More voluntary waves of emigration are sometimes remembered. For the overwhelming majority of famine-era emigrants, the crossing was undertaken as a last resort by families who had already exhausted every other available option for survival, often after watching neighbors, and sometimes family members, die of starvation or disease in the preceding months. The ships themselves were frequently as dangerous as the crisis being fled, and a meaningful percentage of those who boarded a coffin ship in Cork, Derry, or New Ross in 1847 or 1848 did not survive to see the North American coastline at all. Every surname on this list represents not simply a common Irish family name, but a family that made this specific, desperate crossing, and in most cases managed against considerable odds to survive it. None of the 17 surnames listed above constitutes proof on its own, given how common and how widely distributed many of these names were across multiple unrelated Irish families, even before the famine began. Genuine confirmation requires the kind of county-level and parish-level documentary research described above, ideally supported by surviving family tradition about a specific county of origin, a specific port of departure, or a specific ship name. But for the millions of Irish-descended families across North America carrying one of these 17 surnames, whose oral tradition includes some version of "we came over during the hunger," or "we came over in the famine years," the documentary trail connecting that family memory to a specific parish, a specific workhouse register, or a specific overcrowded ship crossing the North Atlantic in the late 1840s is very often there, waiting to be found by anyone willing to trace it back through the records that this catastrophic and transformative decade left behind.